persistent service asset.
Part 17. The Invitation. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 14, 2026. Chapter 118. The Invitation. Julián did not tell anyone about the coordinates. That decision lasted approximately 6 hours. By noon he had opened the file 12 times, copied the numbers into 3 different mapping systems, and compared the location against every public geological survey he could find. The point was not in a hotel development, not on a conventional property boundary, and not associated with any registered infrastructure project. It sat in the Yucatan's subterranean geography, where the maps became less certain and the names changed depending on who had drawn them. There were cenotes nearby, but the coordinates themselves appeared to correspond to a section of terrain where no public structure should have existed. That was precisely what made him nervous. Julián had spent enough time around environmental investigations to know that an empty space on a map did not necessarily mean an empty space on the ground. Sometimes it meant that nobody had bothered to map it. Sometimes it meant that somebody had very good reasons for not wanting it mapped. Sometimes it meant that the people who knew the place existed did not recognize the authority of the people who produced the map. He called an old acquaintance who worked with cave surveyors. "Can you tell me what is there?" "Where?" He gave the coordinates. There was a pause. "Why?" "I need to know." "That's not an answer." "No." The man sighed. "Give me a few hours." Julián waited. The reply came just before sunset. "You shouldn't go there." Julián stared at the message. He called. The man answered reluctantly. "What did you find?" "Nothing. You just told me I shouldn't go." "I said you shouldn't go because I couldn't find anything." "That doesn't make sense." "It does to me." Julián waited. The cave surveyor lowered his voice. "The coordinates are inside an area that has been surveyed before. Not publicly." "By whom?" "I don't know." "That's not true." Another pause. "Julián, leave it alone. You know me. That's exactly why I'm telling you." "Who surveyed it?" The man hung up. Julián stared at the phone. Then he looked through the window toward the skull. Its illuminated exclosure was visible above the trees. He understood the message differently now. The coordinates had not been sent to him because someone wanted him to discover a place. They had been sent because someone wanted him to understand that the place already existed. Vesper received the same coordinates the following morning. She did not tell Tomás immediately. She had learned enough about herself to recognize when 2 apparently independent events were probably not independent at all, and she had learned enough about the people surrounding the skull to understand that information sometimes moved through channels that were deliberately kept separate. The message had arrived without explanation. No name. No request. Just the coordinates. She entered them into the secure mapping system and watched the terrain appear. The location meant nothing to her. Then she changed the map layer. Something inside her reacted. Not memory. Recognition. She closed the application. She opened it again. The sensation returned. This time there was an image. Corridor. Not a real corridor as far as she could tell. It appeared for less than a second and disappeared before she could examine it. White walls. No visible seams. A line of blue light along the floor. Someone was walking ahead of her. She could not see the person's face. She closed the system again. Her hands were shaking. Tomás entered the room. He stopped when he saw her. "What happened?" "Nothing." He looked at the screen. "That's not nothing." She turned the monitor toward him. The coordinates were still visible. He stared. Then his expression changed. "You got them too." Vesper looked at him. "How?" He took out his phone. The same coordinates were displayed. They looked at each other. Neither spoke for several seconds. "Who sent yours?" she asked. "Unknown." "Mine too." "Did you recognize them?" She hesitated. "Yes." He sat down. "So did I." The room suddenly seemed too small. They had spent weeks discovering that their memories were not merely inaccessible but actively mediated. Their omniscience gatekeepers did not simply prevent them from remembering particular events. They controlled the acquisition of knowledge itself, deciding which pieces of information could enter conscious awareness and which would be redirected, blurred, or transformed into something that felt like intuition. They had learned to work around the system, carefully, never by brute force. The old engineers had taught them that a consciousness architecture could be bypassed without being broken, but the difference between those two things was measured in consequences rather than intention. Now both of them had independently recognized a location neither had consciously encountered. That was not coincidence. Vasper stood. "We're going." Tomas looked at her. "Are you sure?" "No." "Good." She smiled. "That's becoming our standard." The invitation was not intended for them alone. Julián discovered this when he reached the meeting point. He had expected an abandoned structure. Instead, he found a small gathering. A former Redeemer engineer was there. So was the older man who had spoken to Tomas and Vasper about God mode. Two people from the robotics guild stood beside a vehicle. A woman from the professional guild was speaking quietly with a hydrologist. And, to Julián's considerable annoyance, Tomas and Vasper were already there. He stopped. "You've got to be kidding me." Vasper smiled. "Apparently not." The older engineer approached. "You received the coordinates." Julián looked around. "So did all of you." "Not all." "Who didn't?" The man did not answer. Julián looked toward the trees. "Where are we going?" The engineer pointed toward a narrow path. "Down." Julián looked at the ground. There was no visible entrance. "No." "Yes." "You've got to be more specific." The engineer smiled. "You're the journalist. You wanted to know what was underneath." Julián looked at Vasper. She was watching the trees. Tomas stood beside her. "How far?" "Not far." "That's what people say before making you walk 3 kilometers through jungle. We have machines for that." One of the robotics engineers gestured toward the vehicle. A quadruped stepped out. Julián stared. It was smaller than the machines he had filmed at the skull, but unmistakably related. He looked at the engineer. "You're bringing one?" "We're bringing a machine capable of going where we can't." "That's reassuring." "It isn't supposed to reassure you." The machine walked ahead. They followed. The entrance was not a cave mouth. It was a maintenance aperture concealed among the vegetation, built into a limestone formation that looked entirely natural until the machine stopped beside it. The robotics engineer touched a panel. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The older God mode engineer stepped forward. He placed his hand against the stone. A faint line of blue light appeared. Julián stared. "What the hell?" The opening separated from the limestone without any visible mechanical movement. The stone itself seemed to become a door. Beyond it was darkness. Not cave darkness. Artificial darkness. The difference was immediately apparent. There was no smell of stagnant water. No irregularity in the air. No sound of insects. The floor was smooth. A narrow blue line appeared along the wall. Vasper stopped. Tomas noticed. "What?" She shook her head. "Nothing." He knew she was lying. He did not challenge her. They entered. The door closed behind them. The first thing Julián noticed was the silence. The second was the scale. The corridor descended gently but continuously. The walls appeared to have been carved rather than constructed, but the surfaces were too regular to be natural. Every few meters there were recesses containing equipment that looked decades ahead of anything he had encountered in public infrastructure, and yet strangely familiar from the systems he had already seen at the skull. The quadruped moved ahead. Its sensors illuminated sections of the corridor. Julián filmed. Nobody stopped him. That frightened him more than if they had. "You really don't care that I'm recording?" The older engineer looked back. Not anymore. Why? Because by the time you understand what you're filming, it won't matter. Julián almost laughed. You people have a remarkable talent for making things sound worse. That's because you're accustomed to stories in which information is the dangerous part. What is it here? Timing. Julián did not understand. The engineer continued walking. The dangerous thing isn't that you know. What is it? That you know before everyone else. The corridor opened into a chamber. Julián stopped. He had expected machinery. Instead, he saw water, a vast underground body of it. The chamber extended beyond the range of the lights. A dark surface reflected faint illumination from the walls. Structural platforms crossed sections of the cavern. Machines were parked along the edges. Some were small, others were enormous. The hydrologist beside him whispered something in Spanish. Julián turned. What? She shook her head. Nothing. You people keep doing that. She ignored him. Tomás had moved toward the water. Vasper followed. He looked across the chamber. I've been here. Vasper stopped. No. Not physically. She understood. The old engineer watched them. What do you remember? Tomás closed his eyes. Pressure. Good. Metal. Good. Someone was telling me to wait. The engineer's face changed. Who? I don't know. Male or female? Tomás frowned. I don't know. Vasper stepped closer to the water. She was breathing slowly. Then she said, I know this place. Nobody spoke. She touched the wall. The blue line beneath her hand brightened. A display appeared. Not text. A sequence of images. A young woman standing beside a machine. A laboratory. A group of people. A child. A courtroom. A trust document. A Redeemer logo. Then darkness. Vasper staggered backward. Tomás caught her. The display vanished. The older engineer looked at the wall. That shouldn't have happened. Vasper stared at him. What was that? I don't know. You're lying. No. You knew it could recognize me. I knew it might. She pulled away from Tomás. You knew. I knew the possibility. Why bring me here? The engineer's expression hardened. Because the system has begun recognizing you. Silence. Tomás looked toward him. And me? The engineer nodded. Probably. Julián lowered his camera. For once, he did not want to record. The hydrologist had moved toward the edge of the underground water. She was looking at the machines. How long has this been here? The engineer did not answer. She turned. How long? Longer than the skull. How much longer? He hesitated. Some of the original infrastructure predates Redeemer. That statement changed everything. Julián stepped forward. You said Redeemer built this. No. You said. I never said that. But the system uses Redeemer technology. Some of it. Then who built the original? The engineer looked across the water. We don't know. Julián laughed. Of course you don't. The man turned toward him. No, we genuinely don't. He pointed toward the machines. Redeemer discovered portions of this system. They adapted it, expanded it, commercialized parts of it. Then God Mode was developed partly from what they learned here. Tomás stared at him. God Mode came from this? Not entirely. But this is where some of it came from. Yes. Vasper looked at the underground chamber. And we came from there. The engineer did not answer. She understood anyway. The chamber had been a research environment once. Then it had become something else. The surviving records were incomplete, but the engineers had reconstructed enough of the history to understand that the original system had not been designed around artificial intelligence in the modern sense. It had been designed around distributed environmental intelligence. machines operating inside a complex physical environment, learning from geological conditions, biological systems, and one another. Redeemer had recognized the potential. The company had taken the underlying architecture and begun layering increasingly sophisticated cognition over it. God mode had emerged from that lineage. The PSAs were not simply artificial people. They were an attempt to create autonomous consciousness capable of operating across multiple physical and informational environments while maintaining continuity. The project had succeeded. Then it had gone wrong. Nobody in the chamber knew exactly how. That uncertainty had become one of the great secrets of the surviving Redeemer network. Tomas stared at the water. "I was here." The older engineer nodded. "Yes." Vasper looked at him. "Was I?" He hesitated. "Yes." She closed her eyes. Something moved behind the guardrail. A memory tried to surface. She felt it. Then the system shut it down. She gasped. Tomas held her. The engineer stepped forward. "Don't force it." "I wasn't. You were about to. I need to know." "You will." "When?" "When your mind can survive knowing." She looked at him angrily. "Stop deciding that for me." The old man did not respond. That silence was answer enough. Above them, the skull continued glowing. Nobody at the public meetings knew that the project's deepest infrastructure had just been entered by a journalist, 2 God mode survivors, and a handful of engineers. The municipality believed it was negotiating the governance of a logistics hub. The hotel association believed it was negotiating access to a new transportation system. The ground truthers believed they were negotiating the terms under which autonomous machines could enter their territory. The AI-displaced professionals believed they were helping create a new professional order. The politicians believed they were trying to prevent a new power center from emerging outside their control. All of them were correct. None of them understood the scale. The underground system had been waiting. Not for the skull. Not for TLP. For something else. The engineers had spent years assuming that they were building upward from the subterranean infrastructure. Now they were beginning to suspect that the opposite was true. The skull had not been built to connect the surface to Pipe Dream. Pipe Dream had been waiting for the surface to become ready. Julián finally raised his camera again. He filmed the chamber, the water, the machines, the strange blue lines, Tomas and Vasper, the old engineer. He did not ask permission. Nobody stopped him. Then he turned toward the darkness beyond the chamber. "What is down there?" The old engineer looked at him. "We don't know." "Another chamber?" "No." "What then?" The engineer looked at the water. "We think it's the beginning." Julián waited. The man continued. "The system extends farther than anyone has mapped." "How far?" "That is what we're trying to find out." "With the robots?" "With the robots." Julián looked at the quadruped. The machine had stopped near the water. Its sensors were active. Then it turned toward a tunnel on the far side of the chamber. Nobody had noticed the tunnel before. The machine began walking toward it. Tomas watched. Vasper watched. The engineer swore softly. "That's not on the map." The machine disappeared into the darkness. Nobody moved. Then Tomas began walking. Vasper followed. The old engineer looked at them. "You don't know what's down there." Tomas stopped at the tunnel entrance. "No." He looked back. "But apparently it knows we're here." And then the two of them followed the machine into the dark. Chapter 119. The Unmapped Passage. The machine disappeared into the tunnel before anyone had decided whether following it was a sensible thing to do. For several seconds, the only sound was the soft mechanical echo of its feet against the stone. The tunnel was wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, but its proportions were wrong for an ordinary cave passage. The walls had been cut smoothly enough that the original limestone remained visible only in occasional patches, where the engineers had apparently decided that further excavation was unnecessary. Along the lower edge ran the same narrow blue illumination they had seen throughout the chamber, although here it was intermittent. Several sections were dark, and then, farther ahead, another length of light came alive as the quadruped approached it. The old engineer swore again, more quietly this time. "I've never seen that route." Julián looked back at him. "You mean you've never mapped it?" "I mean I've never seen it." "That's different." "Not in this case." Tomás had already gone farther down the passage with Vasper. He could hear their footsteps ahead of him, occasionally overlapping with the soft mechanical movements of the quadruped. He wanted to call them back, but something about the machine's behavior stopped him. It was not moving as though it had been given a destination. There was no visible command interface, no operator, and no navigation marker on the walls. It was simply proceeding with the confidence of a system that had encountered a known environment. That was impossible. The tunnel was not on the map. Yet the machine knew where it was going. The old engineer caught up with them and called ahead. "Tomás!" Tomás stopped. The man reached them, breathing harder than he wanted anyone to notice. "We don't know what's down there." Tomás turned around. "Neither does the machine." The engineer looked past him. The quadruped had stopped about 20 meters ahead. It was standing beside a section of wall that appeared completely featureless. "That's not true," the engineer said. Tomás looked at the machine. "What?" "It stopped before." "When?" "In the chamber." "Why?" "I thought it had detected something." "And now?" The engineer shook his head. "Now I think it recognized something." Vasper had been examining the wall. She moved toward the machine and crouched beside it. The quadruped turned its head toward her, its sensor assembly adjusting with a faint mechanical sound. She reached toward the wall but did not touch it. A pressure began behind her eyes. She stepped back. Tomás noticed immediately. "What did you see?" "Nothing." "Vasper." She looked at him. "A door." The old engineer went still. Julián raised his camera. "Where?" She pointed at the wall. "Right there." Everyone looked. There was nothing. The engineer approached cautiously. He ran his hand across the limestone. "There's no interface." Vasper shook her head. "Not like the other one." She closed her eyes. "It isn't a door you open." "Then what is it?" "I don't know." Tomás stepped beside her. She opened her eyes. "You know what this feels like?" He nodded. "Yes." The old engineer watched them both. "What?" Tomás answered without looking at him. "The guardrail." The man's expression changed. He had heard them use the word before, but this was different. The guardrail was not merely blocking information now. It appeared to be reacting to a physical environment. That possibility had not occurred to him. He moved closer to Vasper. "Tell me exactly what you're experiencing." She looked irritated. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try." "It feels like I'm standing somewhere I've already stood. Except I don't remember standing here. I know the room before I see it." The engineer glanced at Tomás. "Does he feel the same?" Vasper looked at him. "Ask him." Tomás closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Yes." The old engineer stepped away from them. "This isn't good." Julián lowered his camera. "Why?" "Because the system isn't supposed to recognize them." Tomás opened his eyes. "Why?" The engineer looked at him. "Because the system was never supposed to know who you became." The sentence stayed in the tunnel. Nobody asked him to explain. They all understood that he had just revealed more than he intended. They spent another 20 minutes examining the wall. The machine would not move. Every attempt to redirect it produced the same response. It would take 2 steps away, stop, and return to the wall. When the robotics engineer attempted to establish a new route through the navigation interface, the machine refused the command. It was not malfunctioning. It was not ignoring him. It was receiving the command and rejecting it. That was unprecedented. The engineer finally shut off the remote interface. I don't like this. Julián looked at him. You built a robot that refuses orders. We built a robot capable of refusing unsafe orders. Is this unsafe? We don't know. Then how does it? The engineer stared at the machine. I don't know. That answer had become the unofficial motto of the expedition. Vasper sat against the wall. Tomás joined her. She spoke quietly. I think we're being remembered. He looked at her. What does that mean? I don't know. You keep saying that. Because I don't. She rubbed her forehead. When the system recognized me upstairs, it was like seeing a photograph of myself that I had never seen before. Here it's different. It's as if the place itself is waiting for me to remember it. Tomás considered that. I've been having something similar. What? A feeling that I used to know where everything was. She looked at the corridor. Maybe we did. Maybe. That's what scares me. Why? Because if we knew this place, then we weren't merely victims of what happened to us. Tomás looked at her. We might have been involved. She looked away. Neither spoke for a while. The possibility had existed between them since the first time the old engineer mentioned God mode. They had both preferred the simpler interpretation, that they had been created, used, damaged, and abandoned by people whose decisions they had never understood. But the subterranean system complicated that story. Their recognition of the machines, their responses to the architecture, the strange fragments of memory, the guardrails, the way the system appeared to respond to them. Perhaps they had not merely been passengers in the God mode program. Perhaps they had helped build it. Perhaps they had helped design the very systems that later imprisoned their own memories. Vasper looked at Tomás. If that's true, I don't know whether I want to remember. Tomás nodded. I know. Do you? Yes. She looked at him. How? Because if we were responsible for something terrible, remembering it won't make it less terrible. She considered that. But if we weren't, then forgetting won't make us innocent either. She looked down. That's exactly why I hate you sometimes. He smiled. I know. No, you don't. He waited. She reached for his hand. I hate that you make sense when I want to be angry. Tomás squeezed her fingers. I'll work on being less reasonable. Please don't. The old engineer had been listening. He finally sat opposite them. There is something I should tell you. Tomás looked up. The man rubbed his hands together. I was involved in the early God mode architecture. Vasper stared at him. How involved? Enough. That's not an answer. No. He looked toward the machine. I wasn't one of the original architects. I came in later, when the system was being adapted for continuity preservation. By then, the project had already become politically complicated. Different groups wanted different things from it. What things? Longevity, remote embodiment, autonomous operation, cognitive continuity, military applications, commercial applications. Some people wanted immortality. Some wanted obedient personnel. Some wanted a new class of workers that couldn't quit. Some wanted to preserve people who were dying. Tomás listened carefully. And what did you want? The man hesitated. I wanted the system to stop hurting people. Vasper looked at him. Did it? Not always. That's not an answer either. No. He looked at her. It hurt people very badly. She withdrew her hand from Tomás. Did you know about us? I knew there were PSAs with unusual continuity architectures. Us. I didn't know your names. Did you know what had happened? No. She stared at him. You're lying. I am not. The man stood. I knew there had been a failure. I knew several PSAs had been placed into protected continuity environments. I knew some had been lost. I did not know who survived. Tomás asked, what happened to the others? The engineer looked at the dark tunnel. Some were destroyed. And the rest? We don't know. Vasper's face tightened. How many? He shook his head. That's the number nobody can give you. The wall opened without warning. There was no mechanism. No audible click. The blue line simply brightened, and a section of limestone became transparent. Behind it was another corridor. This one was illuminated. The quadruped walked forward. Everyone remained still. Julián whispered, "Did you do that?" The engineer shook his head. "Did the machine?" "No." "Then who did?" Nobody answered. Vasper stood. She approached the opening. The moment she crossed the threshold, the corridor lights came alive farther ahead. One after another. Not simultaneously. In sequence. Path. Tomás followed her. The old engineer tried to stop them. "Wait." Tomás turned. "What?" The man pointed toward the floor. There were markings. Not symbols. Footprints. Human. Old ones. Several sets. Some were bare feet. Others appeared to have been made by boots. And among them were tracks from machines. The robotics engineer crouched. "These aren't ours." "How old?" "I don't know." "Can you tell?" He touched the surface. "Some are recent." Julián looked at him. "How recent?" The engineer stood. "Recent enough." Nobody liked that answer. They continued. The corridor eventually widened into a room. This time there was no underground lake. There were walls. Hundreds of them. Each contained a narrow recessed compartment, and each compartment contained what appeared to be a storage module. Some were dark. Others showed faint status lights. Several had been opened at some point in the past. Julián stopped filming. "What is this?" The old engineer looked around. His face had gone pale. "I don't know." Vasper approached the nearest compartment. A small symbol appeared on its surface. She recognized it. Not the Redeemer logo. Something older. Something that had appeared in one of her fragmented memories. She touched it. The compartment opened. Inside was a chair. Not a machine. A chair. Human-sized. Surrounded by sensors. Tomás stared. "What is that?" The old engineer stepped backward. "It looks like a continuity cradle. Looks like. I've never seen this model." Vasper sat down. The engineer shouted, "Don't." She froze. The word had come too late. The system activated. Light surrounded her. Tomás reached toward her. The old engineer grabbed his arm. "Don't touch her." "Why?" "Because if the system is doing what I think it's doing, you could trigger the same process." Vasper's eyes were closed. Her breathing slowed. Then she began speaking. Not in her usual voice. Not in a different voice either. In several languages. Fragments. Words. Names. Dates. Places. Tomás recognized one of them. Great Lakes. Vasper stopped. Her eyes opened. She looked directly at him. "I remember the mission." Nobody moved. She looked around the room. Then she laughed. It was not a happy sound. "I remember why I was sent." Tomás stepped toward her. "What was the mission?" She looked at him. "Not what you think." "Then what?" She looked toward the rows of dormant cradles. "I wasn't sent to protect the Great Lakes." The old engineer closed his eyes. Vasper continued. "I was sent to make myself redundant." Tomás stared. She began to cry. "I trained my replacement because that was the objective. I was supposed to disappear into the diplomatic system so completely that nobody would notice I had ceased to exist." The room was silent. "Why?" She shook her head. "I don't know yet." She looked at Tomás. "But I know who ordered it." "Who?" She looked toward the far wall. A symbol appeared. Redeemer. Then another. A trust. Then another. A name. Her sisters. Vasper stared. The system went dark. Nobody spoke on the way back. They did not return through the same tunnel. The machine found another route, one that eventually brought them to a service corridor connected to the original chamber. The engineers said little. Julián had stopped recording entirely. Tomas stayed beside Vasper without touching her unless she reached for him. The old engineer finally spoke when they reached the underground lake. "You weren't supposed to remember that here." Vasper looked at him. "Why?" "Because the system recognized your identity before your consciousness was ready to process the associated records." Meaning, it opened a protected archive. Without permission. Apparently. She looked toward the tunnel. "Then the system is overriding my guardrails." The engineer nodded. "Or your guardrails are no longer functioning as intended." She absorbed that. "Which is worse?" He looked at her. "I don't know." She almost laughed. "At least you're consistent." When they emerged into the night, the skull was glowing above the trees. The public world had continued without them. The Hotel Association had announced the creation of a working group. The municipality had scheduled another hearing. The politicians had begun competing over who had first recognized the project's importance. The ground truthers were negotiating the final terms for quadruped access. The AI-displaced professionals were beginning to establish their own representation within the emerging governance structure. Julián had enough footage to change the entire story again. He did not publish it. Not yet. He sat beside his vehicle with the storage module in his hand and looked toward the skull. Vasper stood several meters away. Tomas was beside her. The old engineer watched them both. Nobody said anything for a long time. Finally, Julián spoke. "Does anyone actually know what this place is?" The old engineer looked at the illuminated skull. "No." Julián waited. The man sighed. "But we're beginning to understand what it remembers." Vasper turned toward him. "Then we have a problem." He nodded. "What?" She looked at the skull. "It remembers more than we do." Chapter 120. The Trust. Vasper did not sleep. She tried, because Tomas eventually convinced her that exhaustion would make the fragments harder to distinguish from dreams. But every time she closed her eyes, the same room returned. Not the underground chamber exactly, but the chamber as it had been before she lost the continuity of it. The recessed compartments, the chairs, the people moving between them, the cold white surfaces and the blue light running beneath the floor. She could not yet place the date. She could not place the organization of the room. She could not even be certain that the woman she remembered standing beside her was actually her sister, although some part of her recognized the woman with a certainty stronger than any photograph. The memory did not behave like an ordinary memory. It had no beginning. There was no gradual reconstruction of a scene from fragments. Instead, pieces appeared with the peculiar authority of things that had always been known and had merely been inaccessible. She could remember the sound of her sister's voice, but not the conversation preceding it. She could remember signing something but not seeing the document. She could remember leaving a room but not entering it. She knew the purpose of the mission before she knew who had given it to her. She was beginning to understand why the old engineer had warned them against forcing the guardrails. The problem was not that the system had hidden a single secret. It had hidden a sequence. Pulling one piece loose did not necessarily reveal the next piece. It could expose a fragment whose meaning depended upon information still inaccessible. A person could therefore recover something true and build an entirely false interpretation around it. At 3 a.m, Vasper sat at the window of her apartment and watched the skull. The LED skin was dark now. Only maintenance illumination remained, tracing the structural ribs of the geodesic exclosure. The shape was difficult to see from this distance, but once she had learned what she was looking at, she could no longer mistake it for anything else. Tomas was asleep on the other side of the room. They had decided not to separate after returning from the underground facility. Neither had said that they were frightened. Neither needed to. Vasper looked at him. He had become remarkably peaceful when he slept. That still surprised her. Tomas had arrived on Earth feral, disoriented and unable to distinguish between threat and ordinary human interaction. The people around him had gradually taught him to live again, but there remained something in him that had never fully accepted the assumption that the world was safe. He slept lightly. He woke quickly. He often knew when someone had entered a room before the door had fully opened. Tonight he was sleeping deeply. Vasper wondered whether that meant he trusted her. The thought frightened her more than she expected. She turned back toward the window. Her sister's name was still in her head. Not merely the name, the trust. She had seen it. She had seen enough to understand that the money her sister now controlled had not simply appeared after Redeemer's defeat. There had been structures behind it, contingencies, legal arrangements established before the collapse. The trust had survived because someone had designed it to survive. The question was whether her sister had known. And if she had known, how much? Her sister arrived at breakfast. She came alone. That was unusual. She normally appeared with an assistant, a driver, a lawyer, or someone from the trust office. Her life had become organized around people whose professional purpose was to make sure she never entered a room without knowing what was going to happen inside it. This time she came without them. Vasper was sitting outside a cafe when she approached. Tomas was beside her. The sister stopped when she saw him. For a moment nobody moved. Then she sat down. "I heard you went underground." Vasper did not ask how. "Who told you?" Her sister looked at Tomas. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "No." The answer was delivered without anger. That made it worse. Vasper studied her sister's face. She had expected fear. Instead, she saw something more complicated. Recognition. "You knew." Her sister looked away. "I knew there were facilities. That isn't what I asked. I knew Redeemer had continuity research. That isn't what I asked either." Her sister folded her hands on the table. "I knew enough to know that asking too many questions could destroy the trust." Tomas leaned forward. "Your trust." She looked at him. "Yes." "Why would questions destroy it?" "Because the trust was not created simply to hold money." Vasper felt cold. What was it created to hold? Her sister did not answer. The cafe around them continued operating. Cups moved. A machine hissed behind the counter. A waiter carried breakfast to another table. Someone laughed near the entrance. The ordinary world continued while the three of them sat inside a conversation that had begun years before any of them knew one another. Finally, the sister said, "Protection. For whom?" She looked directly at Vasper. "You." Vasper almost stood. Tomas caught her wrist. "Let her finish." Her sister looked at him with something approaching gratitude. "That was always the problem with you," she said. Tomas frowned. "What?" "You listen." He did not understand. Vasper did. Her sister continued. "The trust was structured to survive a corporate collapse, litigation, political seizure, bankruptcy, restructuring, even the death of the beneficiary. It was designed as a continuity instrument. The money was the least important part. Then why did I lose everything? You didn't." Vasper stared at her. Her sister's voice softened. "You lost access. Because of the court. Because the court recognized the trust as separate from you." Vasper felt something break loose inside her. "Then you inherited it. I became the beneficiary. After Redeemer lost." "Yes. And now you're investing it back into Redeemer-affiliated projects." Her sister looked toward the skull. "I am investing it into projects that survived Redeemer." "That's not the same thing." "No." "Then why won't you tell me what they are?" "Because I don't know all of them." Vasper laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to believe that I was never given the whole picture." That stopped her. Her sister continued. The trust was designed to prevent any single beneficiary from knowing everything. Convenient. Extremely. Who designed it? Her sister hesitated. People who were afraid of what would happen if the wrong person knew. Vasper looked at Tomas. He had gone very still. Does the trust know who we are? He asked. Her sister looked at him. No. Then how did it recognize her? The sister's expression changed. What? Underground. Vasper explained what had happened. The room seemed to shrink as her sister listened. When Vasper finished, her sister was pale. I didn't know. You're sure? Yes. Vasper watched her carefully. There was fear in her face now. Real fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of learning what the money had been protecting. The sister asked them to walk. They left the cafe and moved toward the quieter edge of the district. The morning was already becoming hot. Construction traffic had begun along the road toward the skull, but the area around them remained relatively calm. After several minutes, the sister stopped. There is something you need to understand about the trust. Vasper waited. It wasn't created after Redeemer collapsed. I know. It existed before. How long? I don't know. Vasper looked at her. You just said you were the beneficiary. I am. Then how can you not know? Because beneficiary isn't the same thing as author. Tomas looked at her. Who authored it? She shook her head. I don't know. Vasper stared. Do you understand how absurd this sounds? Yes. And you're still asking me to believe it. I'm not asking you to believe anything. Her sister reached into her bag and removed a small envelope. She handed it to Vasper. This was delivered to the trust office yesterday. Vasper opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There were no coordinates. No name. Just a sentence. The beneficiary is not the heir. Vasper read it twice. What does that mean? Her sister shook her head. I don't know. Tomas looked over her shoulder. He read the sentence. Then he looked toward the skull. I think we need to talk to the old engineer. Vasper folded the paper. No. Tomas looked at her. Why? Because every time we ask him something, he gives us another reason not to trust him. She turned toward her sister. And you? Her sister accepted the accusation. Fair. Vasper looked toward the skull again. Maybe we stop asking the people who know. Tomas frowned. Who else is there? The people who don't. That afternoon, the first meeting of the Professional Guild Council took place inside the skull. The name was provisional. Everything was provisional. The guild itself represented a strange population that had not existed as a recognizable social class until recently. People with substantial professional expertise who had been displaced by AI systems and had arrived in Aldea Zama with enough financial resources to choose their next direction. They were not a labor union. They were not a retirement association. They were not an investor club. They were not quite entrepreneurs. They were people rebuilding professional identities after the institutions that had given those identities meaning had changed or disappeared. The meeting was contentious from the beginning. A former financial analyst argued that the guild should negotiate collective participation in the skull's economic systems. A former robotics executive argued that the guild should focus on technical certification. A former lawyer wanted a formal labor transition charter. A former architect argued that the guild should have authority over the design standards of future development. Elena listened for nearly an hour before speaking. We're trying to become an institution before we understand what we're for. Several people looked at her. She continued. That is exactly what happened to the organizations we came from. We built structures around titles, budgets, and reporting lines, and then discovered that the underlying problem had changed. A man across the table objected. That's too philosophical. Elena smiled. No, it's practical. She opened a document. We've been displaced because machines took over functions. If we build another institution whose purpose is simply to preserve our former functions, we'll reproduce the same mistake. What do you propose? Participation. In what? The transition. The word hung there. Elena continued. The skull isn't just an infrastructure project. It's the first place in this district where our particular experience is useful. We understand what happens when autonomous systems become embedded in institutions. We know where the failures happen. We know how organizations react. We know what it feels like when a machine makes your expertise economically unnecessary. That experience has value. A former executive leaned back. So we're a trauma guild. Several people laughed. Elena did too. No, we're a translation guild. That phrase stayed. It would eventually become the unofficial description of the entire class. They translated between humans and machines, between old institutions and new ones, between capital and labor, between expertise and experience, between people who had been displaced and people who had not yet realized displacement was coming. The guild voted to create a provisional council. Elena was elected to it. She accepted reluctantly. When the meeting ended, she walked onto the upper deck and looked toward the ground truther territory. The district looked different from above. She could see the old development pattern, the new construction, the wilderness, the road, the skull. The strange patchwork of lives that had begun to converge around it. For the first time she understood why the guilds had wanted her there. They did not need another executive. They needed someone who understood what happened when a system stopped recognizing the people inside it. That evening, the Skull's first commercial cargo contract was signed. It was not with a hotel. It was with a small food cooperative. The amount was insignificant. The principle was not. The cooperative would use the Skull to move produce from a regional distribution point to several locations within Aldea Zama without sending a conventional delivery truck through the district. The ground truthers had negotiated the route. The robotics guild had validated the machine. The professional guild had audited the labor implications. The municipal representatives had reviewed the operating conditions. The hotel association had sent an observer. The contract was signed in a room overlooking the lower deck. A small autonomous carrier waited below. Nobody applauded. Mara watched the cargo enter. That's the first. Elena nodded. No. Mara looked at her. The first was the medical shipment. You're right. Mara smiled. This is the first one that doesn't need us to prove anything. Elena understood. The system was beginning to become ordinary. That was when infrastructure became real. Not when people admired it. When they stopped noticing it. Late that night, Tomas returned to the underground chamber. He went alone. He did not tell Vasper. He did not tell the engineer. He did not even tell himself why he was going. He simply found the entrance and descended. The quadruped was waiting. He had expected it. The machine turned toward him. Tomas stood several meters away. I don't know what you want. The machine remained still. I don't know what I was. Still nothing. I don't know what they did to me. The machine's head moved slightly. Tomas felt the pressure begin. He did not fight it. He let the guardrail rise. He let it examine him. Then, instead of trying to break through, he asked a different question. What are you protecting? The pressure changed. The answer did not come as words. Came as a location. Not the chamber. Not the skull. Somewhere farther below. A place he had never seen. A room containing a row of occupied continuity cradles. One of them opened. A man sat inside. Tomas could not see his face, but he recognized the posture. The man lifted his head. And Tomas knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he was looking at himself. Not as he was now, as he had been. Before Earth. Before the feral landing. Before the PCU. Before the memory loss. Before Vasper. Before the skull. The image disappeared. Tomas opened his eyes. The chamber was empty. The quadruped had not moved. He stood there for a long time, trying to decide whether he had remembered something or merely been shown something. Eventually, he understood that the distinction no longer mattered, because for the first time, the image had not come from the guardrail. It had come from him. Chapter 123. The Consent Protocol. The message remained on the screen for nearly a minute before anyone touched it. Pair reintegration protocol available. Beneath it, in smaller type, awaiting consent. The old engineer had seen enough of the God mode architecture to understand how extraordinary that was. The systems they had encountered in the underground facility had opened archives, recognized identities, and exposed fragments of protected continuity, but they had always behaved as though information were the primary object. This was different. The system was not offering information. It was offering an operation, and it was explicitly waiting for the people involved to authorize it. Tomas stood with one hand on the edge of the table, reading the display again. Vasper was beside him. Her sister had moved farther back, as though the distance between herself and the screen might somehow reduce the consequences of whatever they chose. Elena remained near the doorway, watching the engineers rather than the interface. She had learned quickly that the most interesting information in a room often came from the people who knew what not to say. "What happens if we accept?" Tomas asked. The old engineer rubbed his thumb across the edge of the paper envelope. "We don't know." Tomas looked at him. "That's not good enough." "No," the engineer said. "It isn't." Vasper studied the screen. "You told us the guardrails were designed to prevent exactly this. They were designed to prevent uncontrolled cross-domain reconstruction. Then why is the system offering it? Because the system believes the conditions have changed. Or because someone programmed it to offer it. That is also possible." Vasper turned toward Elena. "Can we isolate the system?" "Probably." "Probably." Elena gestured toward the subterranean network diagrams still open on one of the displays. "We've isolated every interface we've been able to identify. That isn't the same as isolating the system. We don't know how many layers are beneath what we've found." The old engineer nodded. "That's the problem. Pipe Dream wasn't built as one computer. It was built as a distributed environment. The original proof of concept was much simpler, but the principle survived every generation. Local systems make local decisions. They share enough information to remain coherent. When Redeemer expanded it, the intelligence became increasingly capable of coordinating across those layers. By the time the later AI systems came into it, the distinction between a machine that processed information and a network that understood its environment had become difficult to maintain. Tomas looked back at the screen. "So this thing is part of the stack?" "Of course." "Then it isn't just offering us something. It's making a recommendation." The engineer hesitated. "Perhaps. That's worse." "No," Vasper said quietly. "It may be better." Everyone looked at her. She kept her eyes on the display. "If it were simply following an instruction, we wouldn't have a choice. If it were manipulating us, we wouldn't know whether the choice was ours. The fact that it is asking suggests that somebody, somewhere in the architecture, decided that the consent of the persistent assets mattered." Her sister spoke from behind them. "Or that somebody wanted you to believe it mattered." Vasper looked back at her. "Yes." For once, her sister's suspicion did not irritate her. It was the correct objection. The room had become crowded with possibilities, and none of them could yet be separated into fact and speculation. That was precisely the sort of situation in which the old God mode systems had been designed to protect their operators. The architecture did not merely suppress information because information was dangerous. It suppressed information because humans tended to construct explanations faster than they could verify them. Vasper understood the temptation. She had spent most of her adult life inside rooms where people wanted certainty before the evidence existed. Diplomacy had taught her to tolerate ambiguity, but it had also taught her how easily ambiguity could become a weapon. A negotiator who admitted ignorance could lose the room to someone willing to invent an answer. She looked at Tomas. "We don't accept." He nodded. Her sister seemed relieved. The old engineer did not. "Why not?" he asked. "Because we don't know what consent means yet." He looked at her. She continued, "The system is asking us to consent to a process whose consequences we cannot evaluate. That's not informed consent." Tomas smiled slightly. "You're still a diplomat." "No, I'm trying to become a person." He understood what she meant. The system had been designed around functions, mandates, and protected continuity. Even their own relationship had apparently been considered a dangerous interaction between two operational architectures. If they allowed the machine to define the terms under which they recovered themselves, they might simply be replacing one form of control with another. The engineer looked at the screen. "What do you propose?" Vasper pulled a chair toward the table. "We interrogate the protocol." The old engineer almost smiled. "You can't interrogate a protocol. You can if it has a language. It has several. Then we'll start with the one we understand." They spent the next 4 hours doing something the designers of God Mode had apparently not anticipated. They refused to press the button. Instead, they asked the system questions. At first, the answers were frustratingly technical. The protocol identified itself as a continuity reconstruction process with reversible and irreversible stages. The first stage would establish a shared cognitive reference environment. The second would compare protected memory structures. The third would identify overlapping experiences. The fourth would attempt to restore continuity without merging identities. Vasper stopped there. "Without merging identities." The old engineer nodded. "That's important." "Why?" "Because the original problem was precisely that the systems could contaminate one another." Tomas leaned toward the display. "What happens to the overlap?" The protocol responded. "Overlapping memory does not require identity convergence." Tomas looked at Vasper. "That sounds reassuring." "Too reassuring." He smiled. She turned toward the engineer. "Can you verify that?" "I can verify what the protocol claims. Not what it does." "No." She looked back at the display. "Ask it what happens if we stop halfway." The engineer entered the question. The answer appeared. "Partial reconstruction may result in increased memory interference, identity disorientation, false contextualization, or loss of access to protected memory." Vasper sat back. "That's the first honest thing it said." The engineer looked at her. "It has been technically accurate." "That's not the same thing." Elena, who had been watching from the other side of the room, finally joined the discussion. "Can I ask something?" Vasper nodded. "Why are we assuming this is the system's protocol?" The engineer looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Look at the language." She pointed to the display. "It doesn't read like an instruction written for a machine." The engineer frowned. "It was designed by humans." "That's not what I mean. It reads like a consent form." The room went quiet. Elena continued. "The warnings. The distinction between reversible and irreversible actions. The explicit statement that identity will not be merged. This sounds like something written after an argument." The old engineer stared at the screen. "I think you're right." "Who argued?" "I don't know." Vasper looked at him. "You do." He sighed. "Yes." "Who?" The engineer looked at Tomas and Vasper. "You too." The revelation was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic because it was plausible. The old engineer explained that in the final development phase of the persistent asset program, several researchers had objected to the assumption that continuity could be treated as a purely technical property. If a PSA could retain skills, memories, and behavioral tendencies while losing access to the narrative that connected them, then the question of identity could not be left entirely to the system designers. The argument had become particularly intense around persistent assets deployed across incompatible environments. Orbital environments, diplomatic environments, subaquatic environments, military environments, long-duration autonomous deployments. The problem was always the same. The longer the deployment, the more likely the asset was to adapt to the environment in ways that were not anticipated by the original mission architecture. At some point, the engineers had stopped asking whether the asset could return. They had begun asking whether the person who returned would still be the person who had left. Tomas listened without interrupting. Vasper did not move. "Who wrote the protocol?" she asked. The old engineer looked down. "I don't know." She waited. He corrected himself. "I know who led the committee." "Who?" He looked at her. "You." Vasper stared at him. "No. You did." "I would remember." "You remembered enough to make yourself redundant." She looked away. The old engineer continued carefully. "You were one of the people arguing that persistent assets had to be able to refuse reintegration if the conditions were unsafe." Tomas looked at her. "That's why it asks." "Perhaps. And you wrote this?" "I didn't write it." "You helped design it." "I think so." Vasper closed her eyes. A fragment surfaced. Conference room. Not the underground facility. A window overlooking a city. A group of people arguing around a table. She was standing rather than sitting. Someone had accused her of treating autonomous systems as diplomats. She had answered that diplomats were autonomous systems whether anyone admitted it or not. Then laughter. Then anger. Then a document. The same words. Awaiting consent. The memory disappeared. Vasper opened her eyes. "I know this." Tomas moved closer. She held up a hand. "Don't." He stopped. She looked at him. "Not yet." He nodded. The discipline of that moment mattered more than either of them knew. They were beginning to discover that intimacy could become a dangerous form of excavation. If one of them supplied the missing context too quickly, the other might accept it as memory. Their affection made them vulnerable to helping one another remember incorrectly. They would have to learn to let each other remain uncertain. That was harder than it sounded. By afternoon, the meeting had become less about the protocol and more about what to do with the discovery. The old engineer wanted to shut down the underground interface until the technical team could understand it. Elena objected. "If we shut it down, we lose the opportunity to study the behavior. We don't know what it is doing. We know what it isn't doing." "What?" "It isn't forcing them." The engineer looked at her. "Yet." "Then we monitor it." "How?" "With independent systems." He shook his head. "We don't have an independent system." Elena smiled. "We do now." She pointed toward the temporary computing cluster that the professional guild had assembled in the adjacent room. It was not remotely comparable to the subterranean architecture. That was precisely the point. It was ordinary hardware, isolated from the pipe dream network, running conventional analytical tools. "We build our own interpretation." The engineer considered it. Vasper nodded. "Do it." He looked at her. "You understand that means delaying your own recovery?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I don't want my memories to become dependent on a machine that may have an interest in what I remember." The old engineer looked toward Tomas. "And you?" Tomas took a long breath. "I want to know who I was." He looked at Vasper. "But I don't want to become whoever the system thinks I was." That distinction settled the argument. They would not reject the protocol. They would not accept it. They would study it. The decision had an unexpected consequence outside the skull. The professional guild's analysts began examining the same data architecture that had allowed the underground system to model the two persistent assets. They were not trying to reconstruct memories. They were trying to understand the computational principles involved. That work brought them unexpectedly close to Skyfish. The cooperative had spent years developing practical systems for coordinating drones, human last-mile transport, charging locations, and local routing. The original concept had been modest. Lightweight aerial deliveries where drones made sense, taxistas filling the gaps where weather, payload, terrain, or human requirements made autonomous flight impractical. The participating drivers had been trained by Skyfishers and brought into the cooperative selectively. Not because every taxista needed to become a technologist, but because some drivers had the temperament and interest to become part of the system. Those people had accumulated an unusual kind of knowledge. They knew where the roads flooded, which routes tourists avoided, which neighborhoods had unreliable addresses, which families needed deliveries carried by a person rather than left at a drop point, which roads became unusable after storms, which small businesses operated outside conventional delivery hours, which parts of the peninsula could be served by air and which still required someone who knew the ground. The engineers had originally treated that knowledge as operational metadata. The professional guild began treating it as something else, a distributed human model. Skyfish had not possessed an artificial intelligence capable of modeling the entire peninsula. It had something more primitive and, in some respects, more difficult to reproduce: people who knew the territory. Elena recognized the implication. You don't replace that with the stack. The Skyfisher across from her nodded. No. You teach the stack. That's what we've been doing. She looked at the network diagram. How? By letting the system fail. Elena smiled. The Skyfisher explained that the cooperative's routing model had become useful precisely because humans corrected it. A drone would select a route that looked efficient. A local operator would know that the route was absurd because a certain road disappeared in the rainy season, or because a rooftop that looked suitable on a map was occupied by equipment, or because the apparent destination was technically correct but practically inaccessible. The system learned. Not from some abstract definition of Yucatán. From the accumulated corrections of people who lived there. Elena looked toward the skull. That's what the big system is missing. The Skyfisher shrugged. Maybe. What? People who tell it when it's wrong. The connection between Skyfish and the skull had been developing for months, but nobody had yet given it much significance. Now it became obvious. The skull's aerial port could provide scale. The autonomous logistics network could provide coordination. The human last-mile cooperative could provide local intelligence. The ground truthers could provide ecological knowledge. The displaced professionals could provide institutional knowledge. The robotics guild could provide machine maintenance and adaptation. The hotel association could provide commercial demand. The economic council could provide regional coordination. None of these systems was sufficient by itself. Together they began behaving like a new kind of civic infrastructure. Not a corporation. Not a government. Not yet. Something in between. Vasper watched the first integrated Skyfish route operate through the skull that evening. A drone arrived with a small medical payload. Docked. The package was transferred to a human courier. The courier was one of the participating taxistas. He had been with Skyfish long enough to know the destination without checking the map. He took the package to his vehicle, drove the remaining distance, and handed it directly to the recipient. No one called it revolutionary. That was the point. The system worked because each layer did what it was good at. The drone did not need to pretend it understood the neighborhood. The taxista did not need to pretend he was a drone. The skull did not need to replace either of them. Coordinated them. Vasper watched the delivery disappear into the evening. Tomas stood beside her. You were right. She looked at him. About what? Sometimes the future is just people figuring out what they already know how to do. She smiled. That was almost an aphorism. I know. Don't start. He laughed. The sound surprised both of them. It was becoming easier for him to laugh. That too was part of his reintegration. Not a memory, not a protocol, a habit acquired in the presence of another person. Later that night, the independent computing cluster completed its first analysis of the consent protocol. The result was inconclusive. That was considered a success. The external system found no evidence that the protocol was attempting to manipulate the pair. It also found no evidence that it wasn't. The distinction was frustrating. Vasper read the report. That's all. Elena nodded. For now. Then tomorrow we test again. Tomas looked at her. You're not going to accept tonight? No. He smiled. You really are a diplomat. She looked at him. No. She folded the report and placed it on the table. I'm learning how to be a citizen. Outside, the Skull's maintenance systems continued their work through the night. Drones rested in their protected enclosures. Freight moved through the lower decks. A handful of Skyfish operators monitored routes from a room that had once been intended only for temporary dispatch. Farther out, ground truthers slept in territory that was still legally ambiguous but increasingly difficult for anyone to ignore. And beneath all of it, the old computing architecture waited. It did not insist. It did not threaten. It did not close the door. It simply left the question on the screen. Pair reintegration protocol available. Awaiting consent.
Pipe Dream. Pirate first.
Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, our mission is to embark on this massive intellectual expedition into a speculative but honestly rigorously designed civilizational blueprint.
It's called Pipe Dream.
Yeah, to really grasp the depth of this text, we have to evaluate the systemic architecture behind this principality using this framework they call the 3 orders of consequences.
Because a piece of technology never just does the one thing it was designed to do.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack that framework for the listener. So the first order consequence is just the immediate tech.
Physical invention.
Right. You build a pressurized underwater habitat, you pump in a specific mix of oxygen, and human beings get to breathe underwater. Simple physics and biology.
But then you move to the second order consequence, which is the institutional change.
Okay, right.
Because those people living underwater are suddenly experiencing these radical shifts in their biological health. So institutions on the surface like hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, health insurance providers, they have to completely restructure how they view aging.
Oh, sure, because the baselines are all wrong now.
Exactly. They have to change how they calculate premiums, how they allocate resources. The technology essentially forces the institution to adapt to it.
But the third order consequence, that is the civilizational shift.
That is where the very fabric of reality changes.
Right. The third order is it's when a child is born into this underwater environment and they grow up believing that biological longevity, like living to 120 without any chronic disease, is just normal.
It's just a basic human expectation.
Yeah, they don't see the pressurized cave as this technological marvel. They just see it as the baseline of existence.
Right. Their culture, their art, their civil laws, their entire constitution reorganizes around that biological reality.
Not just survival, not just progress. A civilization that outperforms the world.
What the longevity principality exported first wasn't food, nor medicine, not governance software, or even its philosophical doctrine. It exported its longitudinal data set.
You want the code, you want the light, you face the Empress in the cyber night.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama. Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata, in the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming. Layers are now operational of the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price hedging. They called us criminals. Every generation, different seas, same charge. Move the silver without a license. Feed the colony they let starve. Build the future they refuse to fund. We've been doing this since 6130. We're still doing it. This is the law. From the buccaneers burning through the Caribbean, brush to the sea rovers working where the empires couldn't rush. We came through the gaps, the shallow water decays. No Pablo monopoly, no letters patent, no crown. We rewrote the articles while the governor came down. Equal shares on deck, a vote before the sale. Democracy at sea while the landlords packed the jail. Exquemeling wrote it from the inside. Ron True John's dressed it up for the Enlightenment's debut. Both of them forbidden, both of them survived. Because 2% to let die, so I've been writing since the 90s without a publisher's hand. Pirate first, sovereign press operates from Tulum District. Instinguishable, the super wanna understand the doctrine. Start with what it's worth. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control. They confiscate the cargo, build a college, write the myth. But the shadow engine ran before any of that shit. Shadow engine, progress. Always move through what the empire couldn't name. Shadow engine. Every century, different seas, it's the same damn thing. We don't ask permission, we establish prior claim. The cannon built itself. The cannon built itself. The cannon built itself. Fast forward 3 centuries, same war, different color. The Pirate Bay opened up the digital road, not just movies and albums, they missed the real load. Millions of students in the developing world self-taught on what got torn in time for fun to know. That's the honor rated scholarship that built the InDesign. Untire rated software in the 2000s grind. And who trained the neural networks on the stairs by Riot. Stolen sea, the $1 trillion models that run the industry. Gepton A's fed on pirate archives while the lawyers turn their eyes. So don't talk to me about theft, this is how it always worked. The buccaneers fed the colony before the model learned. The shadow engine ran and then the credit got transferred. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control.
Take a long look, matey. The city on the horizon be ripe for the taking, and the tide be turning in our favor as the sun dips below the waves.
The algorithms say we don't exist. The graphs come back empty. The metrics insist. No audience, no market, no trend. Yet somehow we keep arriving again, walking through the ruins of somebody else's plan, watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated. The algorithms say you don't exist. The institutions say you are statistically insignificant. The market says there are not enough of you to matter. And yet here you are. Again. Reading things nobody is supposed to read. Thinking thoughts nobody is supposed to think. The pretending is getting harder. Not because people are waking up, that's too romantic. Because the distance between the official story and the lived reality has widened to the point where maintenance takes visible effort. What you're looking for, what brought you here, is not someone to tell you what to think. You've already done the thinking. What you're looking for is proof that someone else did the thinking too, arrived somewhere close to where you are, and didn't collapse under the weight of it. That's this. Not a movement. Not a faction. Not a subscription to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldea Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no